In 1945, two Egyptian brothers were digging in the ground with their hands in a hot, silent desert, looking for fertilizer for their crops. A simple task, something ordinary, the kind of thing that happened every day in that region, but then their tool struck something hard, a clay jar buried deep in the ground. They looked at each other. They broke the jar open. And what came out of that hole in the earth was something neither of them was prepared to see. 13 ancient books made of papyrus, preserved for nearly 1,600 years beneath the sands of Egypt. Among them was a text that scholars around the world still debate to this day, a gospel that presents 114 sayings attributed to Jesus, sayings that are not in the Bible, sayings that some people call forbidden and others simply call forgotten. The difference between those two words is greater than it seems, and that's exactly what we're going to explore today. If you enjoy history, mystery, and discoveries that challenge what we think we know, subscribe to the channel now and turn on the bell, because this is the kind of content we bring every week. The name of this text is the Gospel of Thomas. And to understand why it is so fascinating, we need to go back to the first centuries of Christianity, a period far more complex, more diverse, and more turbulent than most people imagine. In the years following the death of Jesus, the movement he began spread rapidly across very different regions: Rome, Jerusalem, Alexandria, Antioch. Each community grew in a relatively independent way, with its own leaders, its own practices, and its own texts. Because yes, there were far more texts circulating at that time than the four Gospels we know today. Historians know this. And many of those texts simply disappeared over time, leaving no trace, until that clay jar in the Egyptian desert changed everything. The discovery of Nag Hammadi, as it became known, was one of the most important archaeological finds of the 20th century for the study of early Christianity. The 13 volumes found by the brothers contained 52 different texts, some already known, others completely new to modern researchers. But it was the Gospel of Thomas that generated, and still generates, the most intense debate. And here is why. This text is different from anything in the Bible in a way that goes beyond its content. It is different in its very structure. The four canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, tell a story. They have a beginning, a middle, and an end. They describe the birth, ministry, miracles, death, and resurrection of Jesus in narrative form. You follow the events almost like a biography. The Gospel of Thomas does none of that. It has no story, no chronology. It does not describe any miracles. It does not mention the crucifixion, and it does not speak about the resurrection. Instead, it is a pure collection of words. 114 sayings, one after another, each attributed to Jesus, each inviting the reader to reflect, interpret, and question. And some of those sayings are extraordinary. One of them says, "The kingdom is inside you and all around you, not in palaces of wood or stone. Split a piece of wood and I am there. Lift a stone and you will find me there." Another says that whoever finds the interpretation of these words will not taste death. There are also sayings that seem to echo the Sermon on the Mount, familiar enough to sound like Jesus, but different enough to feel unsettling. It is this combination of familiarity and mystery that makes the Gospel of Thomas so striking for anyone reading it for the first time. Leave a like now if you're feeling that same mix of fascination and curiosity, because we haven't even reached the most complex part of this story yet. Many researchers associate the Gospel of Thomas with Gnosticism, a spiritual movement that flourished in the first centuries of the Christian era. The Gnostics, a word that comes from the Greek gnosis, meaning knowledge, believed that salvation came not only through faith or sacraments, but through deep inner spiritual knowledge. For them, there was a divine spark hidden within every human being, and the goal of spiritual life was to recognize it and liberate it. This view gradually came into tension with what was becoming institutional Christianity, not necessarily because it was incompatible with the teachings of Jesus, but because it represented a different way of organizing religious experience, more internal, more individual, and less dependent on hierarchical structures. And that tension had direct consequences for the fate of texts like the Gospel of Thomas. But here is something important that needs to be said clearly. The fact that the Gospel of Thomas is not in the Bible does not mean that it was hidden, suppressed, or intentionally destroyed. The real history is more nuanced than that, and in some ways even more interesting. The process of forming the biblical canon took centuries. There was no single council that met one day and simply decided which books would be accepted and which would be banned. It was a gradual and organic process, full of debates and disagreements. Christian communities across the Mediterranean read different texts and valued different writings. Over time, a consensus slowly emerged around the works that had clearer connections to the apostles, that were widely used by Christian communities, and that expressed a theology consistent with what the church was consolidating. The Gospel of Thomas raised questions in this process for concrete reasons. First, its dating. Most historians estimate that it was composed sometime between the years 100 and 150 AD, several decades after the canonical Gospels. Second, its theological emphasis on inner knowledge did not fit easily within the institutional structure the church was developing. It was not a formal prohibition, it was a gradual process of being set aside. The texts simply stopped being copied and used by the main communities, and over time they disappeared from collective memory. Until they appeared again inside a clay jar on an ordinary afternoon in 1945. Share this video with someone who enjoys history and religion, because this is the kind of conversation that deserves to happen out loud. But there is a detail about the Gospel of Thomas that rarely appears in popular discussions, and it may be the most fascinating aspect of all. Some researchers, when comparing certain sayings in the text with the canonical Gospels, notice significant overlaps. Sayings that appear in Matthew or Luke in the form of parables appear in the Gospel of Thomas in a more direct, raw form without the surrounding narrative structure. This led a group of scholars to propose a provocative hypothesis. What if some parts of the Gospel of Thomas are not later than the canonical Gospels, but parallel to them, derived from a shared oral tradition that circulated among the first followers of Jesus before anything was written down? This hypothesis does not yet have consensus. There are serious scholars on both sides of the debate, but it matters because it completely changes how we might look at the text. Instead of being simply a later gospel, it becomes a possible window into even older layers of Christian tradition, layers that perhaps no other surviving document preserved. There is also another element that deserves attention, the very name of the text, Thomas. In Aramaic, the language Jesus most likely spoke, Thomas means twin. The text opens with the line, "These are the secret sayings that the living Jesus spoke and that Didymus Judas Thomas wrote down." Didymus in Greek also means twin. Two names, two languages, the same meaning. Twin of whom? The text never answers. And that silence has generated centuries of speculation that are impossible to ignore when reading the document for the first time. Comment below with the word Thomas if you want us to keep exploring these ancient texts in the mysteries of early Christianity in future videos. The Gospel of Thomas is exactly that, a text that answers some questions and opens 10 more in their place, a document that survived for reasons we will probably never fully understand. Today it is studied in universities and research centers around the world. Some historians believe its sayings preserve genuine oral traditions about the teachings of Jesus. Others believe it reflects the Gnostic theology of the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Neither side has absolute certainty, and perhaps it is exactly that uncertainty that makes the text so alive and impossible to ignore. The story of the Gospel of Thomas is not the story of a forbidden text, it is the story of a forgotten one. And what was forgotten can tell us just as much about the past as what was preserved, because it reached us without the filter of centuries of institutional selection. Every ancient manuscript that survives is a window into a moment when humanity's great questions about God, death, and the meaning of existence were being explored by real people, with all the uncertainty and courage that requires. Two farmers broke a jar in the desert without knowing what they were holding. 16 centuries of silence ended on an ordinary afternoon, and what was inside that jar still makes us ask today, what else don't we know? What else is waiting, buried somewhere, to change the way we understand our own history? That is the question the Gospel of Thomas leaves us with. Not an answer, a question. If this video made you think, leave a like, share it with someone who deserves to know this story, and write in the comments, Do you think there are other ancient texts still undiscovered that could surprise the world? The most interesting conversation always happens down there.